On everybody, today's video is going to be about Chelsea versus Newcastle and how Thomas Tuchel is doing in the Premier League and really conquering every team that he faces so far with this Chelsea side. And let's get right into it. So this will be made using Keyframe like usual, and as always the link will be in the description if you guys want to check it out, get a free trial or something. It's a great way to just produce quality content at a very efficient rate. But let's get right into it. And just one more thing, an analysis of Timo Werner and his transition from Frank Lampard era into this Thomas Tuchel team will be up, a blog post. I'll write it and I'll put it in the description of this video, so it'll be a couple hours after this video is uploaded, but be on the lookout on that, and the link will be in the description as well, or on Twitter if you want to find it there. So let's get right into it. Chelsea played in their typical Thomas Tuchel formation with a back three, as we highlighted here, and then the double pivot they have been using of Kovacic and Jorginho. And now one movement from the double pivot was the ability for one of the holding midfielders to drop between center defenders. And why they did this, as we can see, is to displace the Newcastle Diamond 4. Newcastle play in a 4-diamond-2 formation, and by the commitment of the wide central midfielders of Newcastle to follow a double pivot or any of the other central midfielders out into a deeper area, almost an inefficient area, because when we think about it, the positioning of the Chelsea player here, I'm going to highlight it to make it more clear. The positioning of Kovacic is almost equal to the positioning in the first line of build-up. So by the Newcastle player jumping to follow him, it doesn't do too much defensively in terms of providing pressure on the ball in a dangerous way or give them any greater chances of winning the ball back. All this situation does is it creates a lot of space between the lines for players to come into, like Timo Werner or Marcus Alonso, to then receive the ball between the lines and break the initial press. It also puts a lot of stress on the holding midfielder and John Joe Shelby. And so when we go from here, we can see that the double pivot remain asymmetrically positioned between each other. We have Kovacic and Jorginho are the players we're talking about. And then this also has created a flat forward line for Newcastle, which makes it easier to break with diagonal passes and other concepts. And then the use of Almiron's cover shadow to block Jorginho provides an asymmetric marking system between the Newcastle wide central midfielder following Kovacic using man orientation versus Almiron's use of his cover shadow. So now, moving forward into the next picture, we have the play develop, and now we have, as Christensen moves forward, the double pivot position themselves more in the central corridor, and the three center defenders occupy the center three corridors. And now we see how a flattened front line affects Newcastle's ability to prevent these penetrating passes into the half space. So we have players like Timo Werner, and then we will see Olivier Giroud or Mason Mount coming in on the weak side and taking advantage of these half spaces that are relatively unoccupied due to the level of lack of staggering that Newcastle play with when they get drawn forward towards the ball. So the half spaces that the Chelsea team likes to target through on the left side is through Timo Werner or Marcus Alonso, whereas on the weak side it's usually Giroud checking in as more of a target forward, or Mason Mount position just between the lines. So now we see Olivier Giroud checks to the ball deeper, which forces the center defender to follow him and jump forward, which also shows another problem that Chelsea was able to exploit in the Newcastle shape, was the use of cover shadows in the midfield, which allowed Mason Mount to then just run beyond Giroud into the space that was created, while the fullback was being pinned by the strong-sided winger through Hudson-Odoi, was just pinning the fullback enough to create this space for Mason Mount. And then going back to the use of Almiron's cover shadow, we see now the implementation of the third man movement by Chelsea. So the ball came from the center defender into Giroud, and now Jorginho is able to get on the ball because of the role that Almiron plays, having to create dual roles in the use of his cover shadow to try and to block off the holding midfielder of Chelsea, as well as put pressure on the ball, which then opened up the diagonal pass into the half space for players like Giroud or on the weak side Timo Werner. And then the midfield of Newcastle becomes stretched and there becomes spaces between the lines. So now the next picture, we'll look at what happens. And we see Mason Mount didn't get on the end of this one, but the space was there, taking in behind, and then we have a back four from Newcastle just turning into a back three because of Giroud taking the space and dropping deeper, taking a center back out of the picture, which would open up space for Timo Werner or Mason Mount, making runs between what's left of the Newcastle back four. So now I just wanted a little picture to show the overall shape of Chelsea, and in this picture the center defender Christensen is on the ball, just drives forward just a little bit. The double pivot position themselves in the exterior part of the central corridor, positioned a little bit more towards the half space, and then we have our midfield box with Giroud coming deeper between the lines, looking to displace the Newcastle back four, and then of course the width being held by Timo Werner here and Colin Hudson-Odoi on the weak side. So when we look at this as a whole, we can see a few concepts at play. First, the main relationship that changes a lot is the Timo Werner and Marcus Alonso, and here we see Marcus Alonso then coming in off the wide area to then occupy the half space and then free up Timo Werner in a more wide area, which allows Timo Werner to use his pace and qualities and use these in a less dense space. And then we see Giroud dropping deeper to then make room for players like Mason Mount in behind, trying to bait the center defenders to then jump, creating holes in the back line. But with no pressure on the ball, Christensen is able to then take his space and confront the line of pressure of Newcastle. And one of the biggest things is the Newcastle wide forwards, the two strikers, the 4-diamond-2, so the two strikers in the front line of Newcastle were very oriented towards the wide center back. So if the ball was never played to them, the wide forwards for Newcastle typically were put into inefficient areas and were very easily bypassed. And then the diamond shape in the midfield had a hard time dealing with the double pivot, as well as creating pressure on the ball while trying to control spaces in the areas of the half spaces, or especially in the wide areas, dealing with Giroud dropping deeper and then runs in behind happening simultaneously. So this gave a lot of potential for Chelsea to then move forward. And then one thing I noticed in the match was the tendency for Timo Werner and Marcos Alonso to switch positions. And one rule I start to see is they always look to try and get Timo Werner in the less dense space. So if there's more space between the lines for him to be able to turn and run, he would then occupy the half space, but in the wide area, typically moving forward up the field when the Newcastle shape would become more compact, he would then move into the wide area. So putting him in a less dense area, and it would put Marcos Alonso closer to the assist zone so he can use his left foot for the cutback, which we will see in just a minute. So here's Chelsea on the ball again, and this time Newcastle do not step out to follow Kovacic, who's dropped deeper now in the back line, so almost creating a back four. We have Almiron sticking to his use of dual roles, trying to block access to Jorginho, using his cover shadow while maintaining his reference point of the ball. And then, of course, we have our wide forwards still oriented towards the wide center backs, which almost creates the center mid dropping to become free and be able to dictate play on the ball. And then now, just to note, moving forward, we have Callum Hudson-Odoi and Mason Mount and their wide relationship, when the same will be true on Marcos Alonso and Timo Werner. So now, with the center mid dropping deeper to get the ball and unopposed, unfollowed by the Newcastle players, he is able to then progress the ball in the half space. And here's the relationship we just mentioned between Mason Mount and Callum Hudson-Odoi, as well as the relationship between Giroud and the other two attacking midfielders. And as we said before, when Newcastle shape becomes more compact, this is the cue for Marcos Alonso to play between the lines and give Timo Werner more space in the wider areas to operate. But with Giroud dropping deeper, this then signals Mason Mount to make runs in behind to exploit the jumping center back of Newcastle, which we will highlight right now, to then exploit the space in behind from the Newcastle center back jumping. And as a fail-safe, the wide area will then be progressed through by Callum Hudson-Odoi. So even if the first pass isn't played directly in behind, the wide area is vacated and allows Callum Hudson-Odoi to then attack and then hopefully put in a cross on the ground or a cutback to someone waiting in the box, like Giroud arriving late. So now looking at the second half, and the setup was pretty much the same, but I just wanted to show this because it showed the problems that Newcastle's midfielders had on when to make decisions, on when to track the Chelsea midfielder, like John Joe Shelby here. Almiron is pulled out of the picture, drawn towards the ball, and then when the ball is circulated, he's no longer covering a holding midfielder. So when Almiron jumps and is no longer covering a holding midfielder, this forced players like John Joe Shelby or the other central midfielders of Newcastle to then all step up and cover the immediate outlets. And with Giroud occupying the deepest holding midfielder, it then creates a numerical advantage for Chelsea. Chelsea using their 4-man midfield or even 5-man midfield, depending on the situation, and that would create free players like Mason Mount in the weak side half space to then beat the press and then essentially progress the ball. So I'll show you the midfield shape just when Giroud drops deeper and when Timo Werner on the strong side at this point goes higher. So we see that the midfield shape occupying an asymmetric positioning to overload John Joe Shelby and take advantage of his action of jumping towards the midfielder Jorginho. So now the last little bit in their first phase of progression in their defensive third, Chelsea's back line shifted over, so Rudiger and Christensen would be the only two center backs playing with Kepa between them. So the left-sided center back would then become the left-sided center back Rudiger would go a bit wider and allow Marcus Alonso to drop deeper to help support the build-up phase when Newcastle looked likely to threaten and press. But the four-man midfield again gave Newcastle a lot of trouble in their diamond formation because of the orientation of the forwards towards the wide center backs. This made it especially hard for when the ball would go into the wide area to a deeper Marcus Alonso, who I will highlight just here on the ball. When the ball would go to Marcus Alonso, this would cause a lot of issues for the Newcastle team. So when the wide central midfielder, the diamond, would go and step out, this would then create a numerical advantage for Chelsea, because with 4 players in Newcastle's midfield and 4 players in Chelsea, if a midfielder of Newcastle were to jump out and press a player on the ball in the wider area, this would then create the free man, who we see Kovacic is at the minute, and even potentially, because of inefficient positioning, it could also be Mason Mount on the weak side. So these little situations that Chelsea was able to exploit aided to their game plan very well, and they took full advantage of this. So that's the analysis for today. I just want to get something out quick, show you what Thomas Tuchel is doing with this Chelsea team with his 4-man midfield and the back 3, and the relationships of now Timo Werner and Marcus Alonso forming, adjusting to the qualities of the players that Thomas Tuchel has, and really exciting to see how they do. They got some big games coming up in the Champions League as well, and I can't wait to do them, so I'll see you in the next one.